Hello everybody, good evening. I'm Claire from Eli-b Create and Sew. Tonight I'm going to be teaching you how to make your own sleeveless vest top. So I'm going to show you, we've done a couple sessions together already on how to create the pattern. And tonight it's really all about how to actually sew your top together from start to finish. So I'm going to wait a little bit to see who else is joining in before we get started. I'd posted a couple videos this week just explaining how to lay and cut out your fabric from the patterns that you created. So hopefully you've all had a chance to do that. Hi Candice, lovely to see you on. Hi Thalia. So I know we've sent out quite a bit of fabric this week for tonight's sew along. Hi Angie. So I'm very much looking forward to all the summer sleeveless vests that are going to be made. Hi Donalyn. Hi Anita. Lovely to have you on. I hope everybody has had a good weekend. I can't believe it's the first day back of the kids going back to school. So it kind of feels quite strange, doesn't it? So life hopefully will start to resume bit by bit. So I'm going to just wait a little bit longer and then we'll get stuck in. I hope you all have your sewing machines set up. So we're going to be using our stretch needles tonight, and we're going to be using different stitches on our sewing machine. So we're going to be using our stretch stitch on the sewing machine, and whether you are, depending whether you're using lycra rich fabrics, if you are using a lycra rich fabric, then you're going to need a stretch needle in your sewing machine. If you are using knitted fabrics like cotton jerseys, viscose jerseys, then a jersey will kind of have kind of a rib effect to it. If you're using one of those types of fabrics, then you're going to need a jersey needle. So making sure you have the right needle in your machine is really, really important. Hi, Angela. So I think we are going to get started. So you would have cut out your vest tops. So we're going to start with our front. So we have our front vest top, and we're going to be joining the front and the back together at the shoulder seams. Okay, so you will have put in your little notch at the top of your shoulder. So we're going to take our front, hi Susan, so we're going to take our front and our back, and we're going to put them together right sides facing. So I'm going to place this here just so you can see for demonstration purposes. So I'm making, don't worry, this isn't going to fit me. It's going to fit my 8-year-old daughter. So it's not going to be fitting me. Hi Penny, lovely to see you on. So we're going to be joining the shoulder seams. So I'm going to take my front and I'm going to take the bodice back, and we're going to join the two shoulder seams together. So we're going to place a pin in at the top. So I want you to put a pin through both your front and your back together at the shoulder seam like that. And then put another one on the edge of the seam like that, and then another one on this shoulder seam over here like that. Okay, so I've joined one front, so if I put it like this, I've joined a front and a back together. So you can see here is my front, and the back has got a higher neckline. So the minute I attach that shoulder, there we go. So this is what it's going to look like. Oopsie. I'm using a viscose jersey, which is a very heavyweight. It's got a good drape to the fabric, but it does make it a little bit trickier to handle. So there we go. Okay, so you'll see this is my back, and the one that's more scooped is the front. So I would like you to pop in 3 pins, joining your shoulder seams together nicely. Okay, so we're going to join this side together. And then we're going to stitch across the top of that seam. Hi, Wendy. Okay. So we're just going to put those couple pins in. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start off by joining our shoulder seams, finishing off the shoulder seams, and then we're going to actually do the neckband. And the reason that we want to do that is we don't want our neckline to stretch out too much while we are working with the rest of the top. Hi, Meryl. Lovely to see you. Hi, Angela. Okay, so now we're going to join those the shoulder seams together with your sewing machine on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So you will remember on your pattern, when we were making the pattern, we allowed a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance on our shoulder seam, and we allowed 1 centimeter for our armhole and the neckline. Okay, so we're going to start by joining the shoulder seams together on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Now, you're going to set your sewing machine onto your machine's stretch stitch, all right? So the stretch stitch is basically a stitch where the machine kind of goes forwards and backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, giving the fabric its flex. So on my sewing machine, this is just a normal straight stitch. This is a tricot stitch, so I would select number 9 if I'm wanting to do a stretch stitch on my number 9 on my sewing machine. I could also select number 6 here, this one over here. So I'm going to select pattern number 6, and you want to make sure that your needle is in its middle position and that your stitch length is on a normal. So we're going to be using either your stitches will look like this, your stretch stitch, it'll look like that, or like that. Okay, so I use my number 9 when I'm working with lycra fabrics. But when I'm working with cotton knits and viscose jerseys like this, I find that the 3 kind of straight rows next to each other are perfect for jersey knit. So we're going to join those seams together, and you're going to place your fabric on the edge of your seam allowance guide at 1.5. Okay, so we're going to position that on the edge of my 1.5. Bring your presser foot down, hold on to your threads, and you're going to stitch forwards a little bit and then reverse. Okay, so you're going to notice that my machine's going to come forwards and backwards. Hi, Karen. Forwards and backwards as it stitches that seam. I'm going to stop and then take my pin out. Okay. So right to the edge of the shoulder seam, and then we back stitch. Okay. Cut off your threads, nice and neat. So you will see now that this still has some stretch in it, but the stitches themselves are on a straight, but it's still got some stretch. We're going to do, hi Anna, we're going to do the same on our other side now, joining our shoulder seams together of our front and our back. So you'll see there's the back. If I turn it round, there's the front. So we've joined our one shoulder together, and now we're going to join the other one together on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, so who is sewing along tonight? Who's actually stitching along with us? We're going to reverse again. Okay, and then take out your pin. Okay, right, there we go. So we're just going to take, there we go. Right, so I'm going to place that to one side. So you'll see now that I have stitched that other shoulder seam. Okay, so I've still got some stretch in the seam. That's okay, don't worry, I'll slow it down a little bit. Great, lovely that you're stitching along, Wendy and Meryl, as well as Karen. So what we're going to do now, so we've got our 2 shoulder seams joined together. So what that does is it now gives us a circle for our neck. Okay, so what I'd like you to do once you have stitched your 2 shoulder seams together is to press that seam allowance open. Okay, so we're going to press it open with the iron and then toward the bodice back. So both seam allowances then get pressed toward the back. Okay, so I'm going to grab my ironing board. Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine, Anna. Okay, so we're going to just... Now, I am a fan of pressing. I love to make sure that I press as I go because I just find it gives a good finish. So we're just going to press these seams open. Press this open. Okay, so I'm pressing open first and then towards the back. Now, if you have an overlocker at home, we're going to be overlocking the seam allowance down. Okay, so we're going to be reducing the amount of seam allowance that we have left. So what I'm going to do is position, I've got my overlocker here. Now if you don't have an overlocker, don't worry. You can use either your zigzag stitch on your sewing machine, or you can use the stitch that looks like this. So it looks like a straight stitch on either side with a zigzag down the middle. So you can either use that stitch, or you can use a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. I'm going to be using my overlocker. Now, if you're using your overlocker, you're going to position your machine or your overlocker really. You're going to position the presser foot on the edge of your stitching line. So in the same way, if you're using your sewing machine, you're going to place your presser foot on the edge of your stitching line like that. And you're going to stitch down. Okay, so I'm going to use my overlocker. Okay, and I'm going to place it on the edge and just sew across like so. Now I've changed the settings on my overlocker so that the seam allowance will also stretch, and I'm going to do the same on this side. So same on this side, on both shoulder seams. Okay. So basically what we're doing is just finishing off those seam allowances so that they are nice and neat. Okay. And we're going to move next onto our neckband. Okay. So if I just snip that off, so you can see that the overlocking stretches as well as my stitches. Okay, so trim off the excess threads on either side, like so. Okay, right. So I'm going to put the overlocker to one side for now. So we have our neckband. Okay, so our opening, should I say. So what we're now going to do is we're going to get the neckband pattern piece, or the piece that you cut out for your neckband. Okay, so this will be the longer piece that you had that was originally on the fold. Okay, so when we were cutting out our neckbands, we kind of cut it to the neck measurement without taking away a seam allowance. Okay, so we didn't add on a seam allowance, we just cut it to the neck measurement of the pattern. Now the objective when you are working with a neckband is you want your neckband to pull in, so your neckband needs to be smaller than the physical circumference of your neckline itself. Okay, so what we are going to do is when we were cutting out, I asked you to put in a little notch in your center front. So that's my center front, and there's my center back. So the center front and the center back we're now going to put together, and we want to find the other quarters basically. So what if I take my garment like so and I fold it like that, we've got obviously our center front and our center back. So center front, center back. You're going to take the center back and you're going to match your notch, so your little snip with your center front. So we're going to match those together like that. Okay, so can you see I've got my front and my back? I'm going to put a pin in those to keep them together. And we're going to work back to, you'll see it'll go just beyond the shoulder. So I'm going to keep those together. And then we're just going to keep these two layers together all the way along. So you'll see here's my shoulder seam, but actually here is my other quarter. Okay, so my shoulder seam, because my neckline is higher, let's actually just put a teensy-weensy little snip in that fold. Okay, so just a teensy-weensy little snip like that. Okay, and then I want you to work back from your center again, back to the other shoulder to find your other quarter. So again, you're just putting those two layers together. You're not stretching one more than the other. You're just kind of walking them along to the other side. And then again, put a little snip into the fold. Okay, so little snip. If I open that up now, a little snip into the fold. Okay, so basically what we've done is we've taken the circumference of our neckband and we've divided it into 4. So we've got a notch here, 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 and here. Okay, so we've now taken the circle and we've divided it into 4 and we've given ourselves 4 reference points. This principle is really important. It's the same principle we're going to follow when we're attaching the arm binding to the armholes as well. So we're going to start off with the neck, and then by the time we get to the armholes, you're going to know exactly what to do, or that's the hope at least. So we're going to take our neckband now, and a lot of you will have fabrics that have a different level of stretch. And ideally, what we're wanting is we want our neckband to be smaller than that of the actual neckline itself, okay? So I know that this fabric is really stretchy and I cut it to exactly my neckband measurement. So if I'm taking off a seam allowance and a seam allowance, I'm going to remove 3 centimeters. Now, I don't think 3 centimeters is going to be enough for my neckband. So I'm going to take off a further centimeter. So effectively, I'm reducing my neckband down to by 4 centimeters. Okay, so I'm going to cut 5 millimeters off on this side. So I'm cutting off twice that, if that makes sense. So 5 mil this side, 5 mil that side takes me down another centimeter. Okay, so does that make sense to everyone who's watching at home? I'm just going to measure in, basically keep these edges together, and I'm going to measure in 5 mils, draw a line and then cut it away. Okay. Now, when you're putting on your neckband, it might be that you have to do this a few times to get it right, because again, it totally depends on the level of stretch of your fabric. Okay, so I'm going to take off 5 mils and I'm going to cut that off. Okay. And now I'm going to join. I'm going to join my center back seam together now by sewing a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Okay. So I'm going to make a tube now. So I'm going to make a circle out of my neckband. So 1.5 seam allowance, you're going to do a back stitch beginning and end. So we're going to stitch forwards and backwards. And forwards and backwards at the top. And again, we're going to press that seam allowance open. Okay, so I'm going to take that seam allowance and I'm going to press it open. And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide this neckband into 4. So we're going to break it into quarters. Okay, so I'm just going to press that open like so. Okay, and now we're going to divide this into 4 sections. So I'm going to take my center back and I'm going to fold it, and I've already got my notch previously from making it that my center front. So this is my center back. where the seam join, and this is my center front. So I'm going to take my center front and place it on top of that center back seam, like that. Okay, and keep that on for the two together. So I'm going to place a little pin to keep them together, and then again, where I have the fabric folding, do a little snip again. So this is working out the quarters. Okay, so we're going to little snip like that, and then the same, walk it back onto the other side, and again put a little snip in the top. How are we doing, guys? So we now have got it is fiddly. I'm working with something much smaller, so it is a little bit fiddly. So I've got my center back, and I've got a notch, and there's my center front notch, and there's my other side seam or shoulder notch. Okay. So we're now going to apply this band to the neckline. So I'm going to do this so that my band comes out onto the right side. So I'm going to start with my center back, and I'm going to place the center back seam, so the center back seam of my neckband, onto the wrong side. So I'm going to put it right side facing wrong side. So my center back of my bodice. So I'm going to pop a pin in so I can show you properly. So you'll notice that my neckband is right side, so print facing the wrong side of the top. Okay, and that's because when we sew it in place, this is going to fold over onto the right side of my top. Okay, now remember we only have a 1 centimeter seam allowance, so I'm going to basically join each quarter together, and you'll quickly see if you have too much or too little stretch. So I need to stretch this notch to my shoulder notch. Okay, so I'm going to place both of those notches together. Oh, yeah. Okay, so you see now the two are together. Okay, so you first start by matching all your notches together around your neckline. And I'm now going to stretch this notch to my center front. Okay, so if I don't stretch at this point, so you'll see from this that my neckband here is smaller than my neckline, which is perfect because I want my binding to be smaller and curl around against the bodice. Is this making sense, everybody? Placing a pin into the center front. Now you want to keep your neckband nice and flat. And now I've just got to match my last notch of my band with the last notch of my top neckline. So again, as I say, we're going to repeat this process again when we come to our armhole bindings. Okay. So that is what you should have. So you should have your bodice, neckline, and your binding is smaller than your neckline. So now what you're going to do is you're going to stretch your neckline, your binding, should I say. So I'm going to come to the back here. You're going to stretch your neckband. Okay, so I've got my 2 notches there, and I'm going to stretch to make sure that I can bring these layers together. So you can see my neckband is really stretching, whereas the top isn't stretching very much. Okay, so you'll see we've got to pin and make sure that this neck line of your garment is matching that of the binding. They must meet each other at the top. Okay. If you don't get them to match up properly at the top, your binding won't really fit. So in other words, you're going to be left with a little bit too, you won't have enough to finish your neckband, the width of it. So I'm going to pop in another pin over here like that. So you can see now that the neckline is joined to the binding. So this is my center back. Let's just put that pin in again. So I'm going to do the same, and I'm now going to do the other back section, and I'm going to stretch it and make sure that the neckline is matching that of the binding. Okay, so I want you just to fit that in all the way around your neckline, and then we're going to do our first row of stitching. Now, sometimes you might want to check it first, to check that it is actually big enough, so or small enough really to draw it in. And if you're going to double check it before you stitch, then I recommend that you use a big tacking stitch on your machine. So increase your stitch length to say a 4 on a normal straight stitch, and then that way you can pop it on and see, is it going to gape or is it going to actually hug the body? Okay, so we're going to just keep pinning all the way around. So you can see by actually having quarters, it's a lot easier to manage. Instead of, trying to stretch a neckband on, it's really, you want to get it as even as possible around the circumference of either the armhole or the neckband. So we're going to continue just stretching out that neckline, and I want to make sure that I keep my binding nice and straight. Who's enjoying working with stretchy material yet this evening? Oh no. I was thinking about the next project that we could do. I know there was a call for zippers. So we could do something like a pencil bag or something like that, just to touch on how to do zips. So something like a small little purse, could be a money purse or something like that. Let me know what you guys think. I am planning on doing some Zoom lessons, so we'll be looking at doing kind of a series of items where we kind of construct our own patterns and move along kind of creating a wardrobe of pieces. And by you creating your own little patterns, you then have those patterns that you can manipulate to do various projects with. So we'd kind of start off doing a t-shirt, for example, with a sleeve. And that would be copying from an existing t-shirt that you may have at home. So again, working with stretch. And then how do we create a pattern from that for woven fabric? So for fabrics that aren't stretchy. So there's a lot that we could look to do. So I'm busy playing with that idea at the moment and how I can make that happen. Okay, so I don't know about you guys. Is anybody else kind of got their neckband on? So you're going to be, your neckband, there'll be a lot of pins in place, and we're going to sew with your neckband on the sewing machine. So that's going to go on the feed dog. So we're going to put it through the machine with your garment facing towards you. Okay, so we're going to run round now on a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, so 1 centimeter all the way around. I'm going to take my little extender table off, and that way I can get this neckline onto the whole of the machine. Bring that round here. Okay, so I'm going to stitch with my garment facing me. Now you are going to need to stretch as you go, okay? And you want to make sure that you don't have any folds like this happening underneath. So you want to make sure that your neck binding is nice and flat, because once you stitch in stretch stitch, unpicking it is an absolute nightmare, okay? So as I said, you might want to go around first with a stay stitch to check that it fits and you're happy with it. And we are going to do a 1 centimeter seam allowance, okay? So we're going to come forwards and backwards. I'm starting to sew at the center back, and then I'm going to come round back to the center back again. Okay. And just take your pins out as you go. Don't try not to stitch over your pins. You risk blunting your pin, and you also risk breaking your needle and it hitting your eyes. So to be safer, it's far better to stop and take your pin out. So needle in and then take your pin out. Okay, so just underneath here, just keep checking. So keep turning your fabric to double check that it's nice and flat, so that it's going into the machine flat. Okay, there's no folds or anything like that. And you'll notice that I'm gently stretching the fabric ever so slightly. Okay. How is everybody doing? So this is one technique. So I do an overlocking course in my face-to-face classes, and we do a different binding technique there. So that's more of a t-shirt that we make in straight long stitch. Okay, so Wendy, you're going to be, are you checking it first before you go around and stretch stitch by doing a straight long stitch? You're going to check. So just to clarify, Wendy, if you're wanting to check first that the neckband is the right size, then I recommend that you do a long tacking stitch. If you think to yourself, this looks good, it feels like there's enough elasticity in the band, then you're welcome to go around in the stretch stitch. It's totally up to you at this point. Karen's asking, had to make my neckband smaller, so not there yet. Okay, that's all right, Karen, no problem. Okay, so no problem. I made sure this week that I've got some water. Last week I ended up talking so much, I had such a dry throat. So, right. So just continue to go all the way around, whether you are checking again, as I said, or whether you are sewing for real. And the more that you work with stretch fabrics, the more you will get to know how much elasticity you need. It's really, working with stretch is quite a tactile thing, in that the more you work with it, the easier it actually becomes, and you get to know how much stretch you need from your fabric. And it is really just something that comes with practice and experience. So my advice to you would be, keep at it. You know, keep making, working with stretch fabrics. I think there's a conception that stretch is difficult to work with. And really at the end, it's knowing how to manage your fabric through the machine. And a lot of the tips that I've given with, you know, following notches and things like that, that all helps in terms of you being able to end up with your seams being aligned at the hemline when you've stitched a long section. So I would say definitely keep at it with the stretchy fabrics, because there's so much that you can do. I made my daughter some knickers out of some leftover pieces of jersey fabric, and they are her firm favorites. She actually doesn't like wearing the shop bought ones anymore. So you know, that's a fantastic thing to be able to go over with the you know, making these bands. So if you made knickers, so for example, you'd be putting elastic in the waist, you'd be tracing off your pattern in exactly the same way that I taught you how to trace the pattern off for your t-shirt, and you would be making, so say for example the leg opening, you'd be making your binding a bit smaller than that of the circumference of the leg opening. So again, there's nothing stopping you having a go at making your own knickers if you fancied. You know, again, it's a fantastic way of practicing these techniques, and if it's a little bit skew or wonky, no one's going to see it. So you know, that's worth trying out. So I'm nearly at the end of my neckline. And I've just noticed that when I started off, I had folded my fabric over a little bit. So before I get there we go. I just want to release that seam allowance so that I can pop it underneath so it lies flat. Now, when you are unpicking seams in stretch fabrics, just make sure that you're only catching the machine stitches, because if you catch the knit, you will make a hole. So be very careful when you are unpicking. If you need to unpick, hopefully you won't have to. I'm just going to make sure that that goes flat. And stitch across. Okay. Right, so I've stitched my neckline all the way around. Okay, so I will show you what my centre back looks like. So you can see there I've got my centre back, my seam allowance is nice and open. I'm going to reduce the bulk at the corners. So I'm just going to cut across the seam allowance like so. So you'll see that's just to reduce the bulk that will be inside the back of my neckline. Now, another reason, do that to the other side as well, sorry. Now, another reason that I started my centre back with my seam is that I'm not going to be putting a label in this, and I don't want to put a little, little tab. They tend to irritate my daughter's skin. So at least by having the little seam at the back, that tells us immediately that it is the centre back. It's also obviously higher than the front. But you will see now, so if I do that, you'll see that the neckband itself is actually pulling my neckline in a little bit. Can you see that? Can you see that? Okay, that's fine, Anna. If your machine doesn't want to backstitch on stretch stitch, that's absolutely fine. A stretch stitch by nature will be going forwards and backwards, so it's actually backstitching every stitch that you do anyway. That's why it's a nightmare to unpick. Okay, so if I do this, you'll see that the neckband is actually pulling my neckline in quite nicely. Okay, so you can guess what's going to happen next. Yes, you guessed it, I'm going to press. So what I want to do is press my seam allowance open first and then press it up toward the neckline. So, to the binding, sorry. So press open first. Okay, and here on our shoulder seams where we have this extra bit of fabric from our shoulder seam allowance, I want you just to trim that little bit down. Okay, so I'm just taking the bulk away from my shoulder seam. So do the same on this side as well. So you're just trimming away that excess fabric. Be careful not to cut your neckband, okay? Very, very careful. So we're now going to press those seams. Okay. Okay, great. So, a little bit of pressing. Okie dokie. So we're just going to press this open first. Now again, the objective of the pressing is that it helps to stretch and set those stitches. So I'm going to press open and then toward my neckline all the way around. So I don't want to stretch my neck too much, just enough so that I can relax the tension on those stitches. Okay. Okay. How are we doing, everybody? So that worked for you, Anna. That's good. Okay. I like to give a couple puffs of steam every now and again. Okay. Just got the last little bit of the back of the neckline. So yeah, working with stretchy fabric, you just got to go, as I say, bit by bit. Here we go. Okay. And by pressing those seams open, and then you'll see it's really nice and neat at the top on the inside of that neckline. So our next step is going to be to take our binding and we're going to fold it over just a little bit like that. Okay, so it was like this. We're going to fold it over and then over the top of our seam like that. Have we got this? So let me pop this over here. And we're going to pop a couple pins around and then take a hand needle and thread and just run a little running stitch. So do a little tacking stitch. So again, I'm going to flip my camera to show you from the other side. Okay, so let's start at our center back, for example. So I'm also going to trim away some of the excess of my seam allowance on my center back of my neckline, like that. And I'm going to fold the fabric over like that. And then I'm going to fold it over again like that. And we're going to place a pin in and out. So what you want to do is make sure that you are covering your stitching line. Okay, so there's my fold, and I'm going to fold it over again like that. In and out. Okay, so can you see what that looks like? So try and keep this the same width. So again, fold it, you know, it's naturally now, because the neckband is smaller, it's naturally wanting to fold, and then you're going to fold it in half again like that. And pop another pin in. Like so. Okay, so you can see it's naturally curling in towards the neckline. Is that making sense? Did everybody get that from the demonstration? So we're just going to pop pins in all the way around. How are we doing? Okay. So if your neckband is tight enough, it will naturally be wanting to curl back on itself, which will actually make it a lot easier. Your main point of focus now is to make sure that this row of stitching, you don't see that, so that your fold line supersedes that stitching line. Okay. So it's always good to start with your neckline, as I said, because what you don't want to do is work with the rest of the garment, get to your neckline, and your actual t-shirt or your vest neckline has stretched beyond the point of being able to pull it in with your neckband. So I always start off with my neckbands and necklines. It actually doesn't matter what I'm sewing. I always start by getting that neckline done as quickly as possible, because even with woven fabrics, you can stretch out the fabric, especially if you have a V neckline, for example. It can easily stretch out while you are just handling the rest of the garment. So I find it best to either stay stitch the neckline, or if I've got a facing, I do my shoulders and my neckline completely before I even work on the rest of the dress or top. Okay, so this is a little bit fiddly, but it is worth taking the time to fold and pin in place. So I'll show you again from the back. Okay, just get my pin in my finger. So you can see it's naturally, my binding is naturally now wanting to fold in half, fold over my stitches, and I'm placing a pin in and out. Okay, so I'm covering this row of stitching, folding it over the neckline and placing a pin in and out. Okay, and I'm nearly at the end now, so it's naturally just curling in towards the neckline. So you can see I've just got that little bit left to do. Okay. So we're going to get a needle and thread, and as I said, just do a little tacking stitch all the way around the neckline. So, you know, things like this, a binding on a neckline is very visible, okay? It will be the closest thing to your face, if you aren't wearing jewelry, that is. So you want to make sure it's as neat as possible. So whenever you are working with something that you think, oh, the finish is really important on this, like a neck binding like this, take the time to hand tack it to get it looking just right. Because you will be very thankful at the end. So I'm just going to get a different colored thread to use as a tacking to do a running stitch by hand. So I'm going to use some purple thread. You can use whatever color you want, just something that is easily seen. And I'm just going to do it a single row of thread, so just a single. Okay, and I'll come to the back to show you again as well. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to do a kind of basting stitch just to grab it in place. And I'm wanting to catch that fold as close to, let me try, this is difficult. Okay, so I'm wanting to come in as close to that fold as possible. Okay, so in and out, in and out. So you'll see I'm very close to the fold of the fabric, and then just pull it through. Okay, and so nice and close together all the way around your neckline. Okay, so in and out all the way around your neckline. So we're just going to whiz along. These don't have to be pretty. The objective is to make sure that you are covering the stitches underneath. And at the same time, you're just checking visually that your binding is the same width. So as I say, we're going to do this twice on the armholes as well. And as I say, it's definitely worth taking the time to do this little tacking stitch. Because it's going to make your stitching easier, and if you're going along, you're going to just sew once. So take a little bit of time, do this row of tacking, and then you know you can stitch with confidence in the stretch stitch, so it's not going to you're not going to have to unpick, because you'll know it's all correct. So that's really the only time that I really do advocate tacking, is when it is absolutely necessary. And on a neckline like this, I think it is. So we're going to just whiz along again. Hi, Julie. Lovely to see you on. So keep going. How are we all doing with our hand sewing? Is anyone joining me in the hand sewing? Keep going round. Okay. All right. So we're nearly there. So I'm going to just demonstrate again. So I'm going to flip the camera so you can see from the back again. So you're coming in nice and close to that fold line, nice small stitch and out on that fold line. So my stitches are underneath, okay? So I've got enough of a fold to make sure that I'm going to be covering those stitches with my neckband. I don't actually want to see those stitches at all. Not whizzing quite as fast as me, Meryl. That's fine. It's no rush. It's no rush. It's more about trying to just get this nice and precise. Okay. Are you able to see quite clearly what I'm showing you in the video? So in, nice and close to the edge of that fold, and out. Yeah. In and out. Okay. So a little bit more for me to go. So as I say, once you've done your tacking, we're then going to run it through the machine on a stretch stitch. And it might be that you want to try it on, double check that you are happy with it, because as I said, once you do that stretch stitch, there's no going back. You might as well cut a deeper neckline and add another neckband. But if you do that too many times, then you end up with a really low neckline. So I wouldn't recommend cutting it off too many times. Okay. Right. Did everybody kind of find, how did everyone find making the pattern? Was that fun? Did you enjoy learning a couple techniques on how to trace off a pattern? I mean, the vest top is very simple. It's only 2 pattern pieces, so it's not mega, but there was a couple good techniques in there, so it would be great to know how you found it. Okay, so I'm nearly at the end, and I'm just going to kind of do another little in and out to finish off that stitch, just to hold it and stop it from unraveling. Okay, so I'm at the back. Okay, there we go. Right. Okay, so if I hold up my shoulder seams now, you'll be able to see, oh, there's the neckline. So you can see even from the side, the neckband isn't tilting forwards, it's coming toward the body. So that's the whole objective, okay? So you can see my neckband still stretches as well. The whole objective is that that neckband draws it toward the body. Okay, so I'm now going to stitch, and I want to make sure that when I'm sewing as close to the folded edge as possible, all the way around the neckline. Okay, so if you go over the edge of this fold, then the binding's going to lift up. So do make sure that as you're stitching around that you are definitely catching the edge of that fold. So just be just inside the edge of that fold. Okay, now I'm going to change my thread quickly, just because my fabric is a lot lighter on the reverse than on the top. So I'm going to use a darker thread just to do the top stitching of that neckband. So that will give a little bit of time for those of you catching up at home. Okay. So yes, any suggestions anybody has on additional things that they would like to learn, please do feel free to message me and let me know what you would fancy doing. And as I said, I can then have a look and see how possible it is to work that in over the next few weeks. So I'm going to start at my center back and then work all the way around. Now, as it's a 1 centimeter seam allowance, if you use your presser foot as your guide and move your needle into the left position, then you should be just in the right spot. Okay, so I'm going to move my needle over to the left, and I'm just going to show you the position of my needle. So you can see I'm placing my presser foot on the edge of the fold of the fabric, and you can see that my needle is all the way to the left. Okay, so it's all the way to the left. So it's going to be stitching just in line with my hand tacking. Okay, so presser foot on the edge of my fold of the binding, and move your needle all the way over to the left so that you are then stitching very, very close to the fold. So take your time, okay, when you are stitching this section of the neckline. You want to make sure that you really get it in the right position. So don't rush, take your time, but go very slowly, and just check as you're going around that your needle, that you are actually catching the binding on the edge. Okay, so I'm going to start stitching round. That's great. So go nice and slowly all the way around. Now, if you stitch over your pre-tacking stitches, don't worry, you can always take them out at a later stage. And if they do get caught, you can just use your seam ripper just to lift the stitches out. Okay. So nice and slowly, all the way around. Okay. Just keep going. So you're kind of constantly going to be looking at your presser foot and at the stitching line that you've done by hand. Okay, so if I do that, then you'll be able to see a little bit. So I'm just feeding it into my machine. How are we doing, Candace? Okay. So just keep going round bit by bit. Oh, that was very close to the edge. Okay, so I'm coming round to my starting point. And I'm going to just little back stitch. So for those of you who are using, like Anna, you said that your machine didn't do a back stitch. Not to worry, just supersede. So a little bit beyond where you started, okay? So that your stitches kind of overlap each other, but on top of each other, okay? So that is the neckline. So just set your machine needle back to the middle if you are able to move your position of your needle. And snip those threads off, and you can guess what's going to happen next. We're going to press. So I'm going to just take the purple threads out. So you'll see from the top side, you can see I've got my row stitching, okay, running there. And if I flip the camera around, see, that's what it looks like at the back. So it's a really, really nice, neat finish. So you can see I've got a small little gap there. So now I'm going to pull out the purple threads. Okay, so I'm going to pull out my tacking stitches before I press, because I want to make sure if there are any little holes or anything like that from the needle from my tacking, that they disappear with the pressing. So I can see I've pulled, and over here it's got a little bit caught. That just means that my machine stitched over those stitches, so that's not a problem. I'm just going to, there we go, so that's lifted out really nice and easily. Okay, so see, your tacking stitches can be very easy to pull out. If they snap, that's fine, then just look for the tacking stitch again and just lift it out. Okay, now the stretch stitch is really strong because it's basically, as I said, where the machine goes forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards. Is that stitch? Okay, yes, so I'm busy pulling out the tacking stitch. I did it by hand, Wendy. So I'm busy pulling out the pre-tacking stitch. And then when you stitch with the machine on stretch stitch all the way around, that will be to basically hold your neckband in place. So I'm going to show you again from the back. Again, this process we're going to duplicate when we come. So there we go. You can see, oh, see there's my stretch stitch all the way around the neckline. So that's the right side and that is the wrong side. So you see it's almost in the ditch of the back of the neckband. Okay, so that's the neckline. So now just going to give it a quick press, and then we're going to move on to joining our side seams together. Okay, so I'm going to put it down onto my ironing board and just give it a little steam. Okay, and this again will just set the stitches. Get a facial while we're at it with the steam. There we go. Okay, so doesn't that look good? There we go. So I hope that you're happy with your neckline. Okay, so that's the neckline done and dusted. So again, you can see it's so nice and flat. So the objective again, your neckband is smaller to pull in the neckline so it comes against the body. This process we're going to duplicate on the armholes. So I think what we're going to do is we are going to join our side seams and we're going to hem the garment. Then we're going to come back and I'm going to do one armhole with you, and then you can do the other armhole at your leisure, so we don't go on for too long. So we're going to take our top now and we're going to take our side seams and we're going to put them together. Okay, so if I do it this way, here is my neckline. There's my neckline. So I'm going to take the right side of my back and my front, and I'm going to pin down the side seam. Okay, so I'm going to pin down the side seam on this side and down the side seam on the other. So we're just going to take our fabric and we're going to match those notches again. So I'm taking my two side seams and you'll see I've got a notch over here and I want to match the notch over here. Okay, so match your notches and we're going to stitch down on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Now if you want to check the fit of your vest top, again, I suggest that you do a tacking stitch. So a straight stitch on a stitch length 4. So a nice big tacking stitch. And that way you can put on your vest top, you can sew both sides, try it on and see if you're happy with the size of it first. Because it might be that you go, oh, actually I want to make it a little bit smaller. And if you do want to make it a bit smaller, then you know you're just going to sew come in on your seam allowance, so you'll just take it in a little bit. So I would recommend first stitch on your 1.5 seam allowance because that's what we allowed with the pattern, and then try it on. If you feel that you need to take it in, then you can do that before we come to doing the hem, so you can take it in as much as you need. So you'll probably want to pop it on and double check. Okay, and with stretch fabrics, as I was saying right back in the beginning, you want to make sure that, you know, when it comes to using different stretch fabrics, your pattern, you might need more or less on the side seams depending on the level of stretch that you have from your fabric. So it might be worth on your little pattern writing, you know, what 10 centimeters of fabric will stretch to. Okay, so I've pinned one side seam, so I'm now going to pin my other side seam. So I'm going to take the two side seams and put them together, right sides facing each other, and again pin down the side seam. Okay, so we're just going to pin down, match your notches again. So I'm matching my notch, and then I'm coming back up to the corner. Okay, and so that's one notch here. I'm going to find my other notch. Ah, there it is over there. So match that notch and that notch together first, and then I pin back here. So you'll see with stretch fabrics, it's really just how you handle it. You don't want to be stretching and pulling everything all the time. You want to keep your fabrics together on the edge, like so. Okay, and just keep pinning down to your hemline. There's my other notch there. So I'm going to pin in and pin in. There we go. Any questions so far? Any questions from anybody? Can I leave the neck binding and come back to it? At what stage are you, Candice, on your neck binding? Where are you at? Are you at the tacking stage, or are you still trying to stitch it on? Hi, Janine. Okay. So we've joined our two side seams. So if you look at it like that, we've got our side seam here pinned and our side seam here pinned. Okay, so I'm going to quickly change my thread back on the top to the lighter thread. Again, it's just me being me, really. I like everything to be quite right. So I'm switching back to my lighter thread. So Candice, you've said you've got it pinned on for now. Okay, if you think you're happy with it being pinned on, then that's okay. It's just your pins might come out when you are doing the rest of the garment. Okay. Hi Stuart, lovely to see you on. Okay, so I'm just changing my thread over. Okay, so I'm going to put my table back on now, and we're going to be stitching down the side seam on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and on a stretch stitch, and we're going to do a reverse at the beginning and end of our side seams. Okay, so you're just going to do your 1.5 on your seam allowance. Do that, there we go. So 1.5 on the seam allowance, needle in, and remember we are back on our straight stretch stitch. Okay, so we're coming down with a stretch stitch. Again, if you're wanting to check the sizing first, just do a straight tacking stitch, check it, so put it on, check that you're happy with it. If you want to take it in, then take it in with your stretch stitch. Okay, so we're going to stitch 1.5 in, forwards and backwards at the top, and just stick to your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. bobbin threads out the way. So all the way down. And you'll notice that your feed dogs are really doing the work. My hands are just guiding my fabric. I'm actually letting the machine do the work. Okay. Make sure you stop and take your pins out. Okay, right. So you're going to repeat that process on the other side seam, okay? And we're going to stitch that in place, and then we're going to press those seams open, okay? So repeat the process on your second side seam, but there you can see I have my side seam stitched. And trim off all those little threads, so you want to be nice and tidy as you go. Otherwise you end up with a whole bunch of threads in your armhole when you're trying to tidy up at the end. So it's much better just to tidy as you go. Okay, so we are going to do the other side seam now on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance on your stretch stitch. So just continue doing that. So who's finding the stretch fabric okay to work with? Is it proving easier or more difficult than you imagined? So just keep going with your stretch stitch all the way down your side seams. And I'm going to just tilt my iron. It beeped at me earlier to say it was turning itself off because it hadn't been used. You're still tacking stage for the neckline. That's okay, no problem. Yes, Anna, shame. I think you're working with the more lycra rich fabric. Which is a little bit more slippery to deal with, but let's put it this way, it can only be easier after you've worked with something that tricky. So you're doing great, don't worry, you're doing great. So all the way to the end and backstitch. I would say the fabric I'm using is very similar. It doesn't have that kind of satinized feel with the lycra in the fabric itself, but it does move and slip around a bit too because it's a heavier viscose jersey. So yes, good. So we should have two side seams stitched now. So we've got one side seam there, the other side seam there. So we're going to press those seams open next. Okay, so I'm just going to place, now you could use your sleeve roll that you made earlier on. Here's one I made earlier. So we're just going to pop that in. If you don't have one, it's not the end of the world. So I'm just going to press that seam open now nicely. And again, the pressing is so that we can stretch and set those stitches. Anna, with the lycra, you might want to use a press cloth over the top so that your iron doesn't melt the fabric, because obviously the lycra is definitely more synthetic. So you may want to use a press cloth if you're pressing, but obviously I can't see if you are or aren't, so that's up to you, isn't it? So Okay, so that's my one side seam pressed, and I'm just going to come over to do the other side seam. And what we're going to do is we're then going to overlock those side seams together. Okay, so Celia, you're saying unfortunately your fabric kept getting caught in the machine when you were using the stretch stitch, so you didn't get further than the shoulder seams. Okay, that's okay. It doesn't matter. You can, this video will be posted onto our YouTube channel and the Facebook page, so you'll be able to watch it again bit by bit later. Shame, I'm sorry. So a little tip for you then, Celia, if you find that your fabric is getting caught in the whole time, then hold onto your threads when you start sewing. So if you hold onto both your top and bobbin thread, and you just give it a gentle tug as the machine starts to move forward and pull your fabric, then it'll help you get past the beginning bit. So you're probably starting too close to the edge. And sometimes, as I say, you just need to gently tug those threads to help pull it through the machine. So hopefully that will help you. Okay, so I've got my side seams pressed open. We're now going to overlock them closed. So I'm going to just pull my overlocker forward, and I'm going to use my overlocker to overlock those seams together. And I'm going to trim just a little bit off of the seam allowance, so just a teeny tiny bit off, so that I can reduce the bulk down the side seam of the body. So was that helpful, Celia? My overlock is a bit noisy. So I'm also going to do my other side seam, so overlock both. So an overlocker, when you're working with stretch fabrics or any fabrics, gives you such a lovely finish. So you can see I've taken just a tiny bit off the edge of the fabric just to help neaten it up. Okay, so I'm now going to do the other side seam. Now, I was thinking another style that you could use this pattern from. So my objective has been to try and help you create patterns that you will be able to make again, that will fit you, but also give you blocks, basically. So a block is a basic foundation pattern that fits you. Sorry, just try and get this camera right. That fits you nicely. And I was thinking another kind of style that could work really well, or that we could adapt this pattern from, is giving you a top with a cowl neckline. So it would be a case of just adapting the front pattern piece. And a cowl neckline can be really, really flattering, whether you're small busted or large busted. Because it creates folds, so it can either disguise or add volume depending on which option you want. So I was thinking that's another option. So if you are keen to give that a go, let me know, and then we can obviously do something along those lines. So that is our side seams done. So I'm now going to overlock the edge of the hemline. So I said we're going to do the hem, and then we'll do one of the armholes together, and I'm going to leave you to do the second armhole by yourself, because you'll just be repeating exactly the same process that we applied on the neckline. Okay, so I'm going to start by overlocking my side seams. Now I want to make sure that my side seam, okay, so this is my front, that's the back, and I want to make sure that when I'm overlocking that my side seam goes toward the back of my top. Okay, so both side seams need to go toward the back. So I'm going to hold that one down, and I'm going to put it through my overlocker right side facing toward me. Okay, and I'm just going to change the differential feed a little bit so that it will pull through nicely. And I'm just going to stitch all the way around my hemline. My other side seam, I also want to go toward the back. So I'm going to check the neckline. There's my back. Here's my side seam, and I want it to go towards the back. Okay, so I'm going to pop a pin in there. But I am going to take my pin out so that I don't overlock over the pin, okay? Overlockers and pins don't go together. You can cause a lot of damage to your overlocker if you go over it with a pin. You can blunt in your blade, you can bend your looper. So if you are using a pin to hold it in place, remember to take it out before you stitch over it, okay? And when you are finishing off the hemline, try not to stretch your fabric, because if you do stretch your fabric, your hemline is then going to go all wavy, and that's not going to look very nice. So let's just, if you don't have an overlocker, it's fine. You could use your zigzag stitch, but if you find that your zigzag stitch is in fact stretching the fabric, then rather don't finish it with an overlock stitch. It's a knitted fabric, it's not really going to fray. So I'm just doing this as habit, and it just gives a really nice professional finish to my garments. So our next task is going to be to turn up a 3 centimeter hem allowance. Okay. So we're going to do the hem. And then we'll tackle the armholes. And as I said, that's just to give you a chance to be able to catch up, and we'll then obviously be going over the neckline process again with your armholes. Okay, so I have now overlocked the hem edge, and what we're going to do is we're now going to fold up and measure 3 centimeters. So I want you to measure from the edge of your fabric up to the fold. So from here to here, 3 centimeters, and pop pins in all the way around your hemline. Okay, so I'm going to tilt the camera down so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to take my tape measure and I'm going to measure 3 centimeters all the way around. Okay, 3 centimeters, and I'm going to place a pin in like so. Oh dear, I caught the underside. Okay, so measure 3 centimeters all the way around, and just keep popping those pins in. So you'll see I'm kind of patting my fabric every now and again, rather than being quite heavy-handed. I'm very gentle in my touch with this jersey fabric. It tends to respond better when you're not trying to stretch it too much. Okay. Now, you can see there's a little bit of puckering with my overlocking. That is going to disappear when I have stitched my hemline in position. So just keep checking that it is 3 centimeters all the way around. So what I'm trying to do is to make sure that my hemline is parallel all the way around, 3 centimeters. When we're going to stitch it in place first, and that is so that we can hold it in place. We're going to do it with the machine just on a big tacking stitch, and then we're going to come and do the 2 rows of top stitching, okay? Because then we can sew around with confidence from the right side. So I'm going to show you a method that I use every single time I do a hemline in a stretch fabric. It gives you, one, a really good finish. Second, it's a lot stronger because you end up with 2 parallel rows of stitching and so it kind of looks like it's been cover stitched. So, you know, like when you buy a t-shirt in a shop, at the hem line you'll have 2 parallel rows on the top, and on the underside of the hem you have this overlocking looking stitch. They actually in factories use a machine called a cover stitch machine, and it's a fairly expensive piece of kit. So this gives you the same kind of effect, but it's actually even stronger than a cover stitch, because I don't know if you've noticed, I certainly have with t-shirts I've bought, if the hem, one of the threads in the hemline snaps, then the whole thing starts to unravel. Whereas this method, it's highly unlikely that your hemline will start to unravel. Okay, so just take your time and gently go around, making sure that you've pinned your hemline nice and neatly. Okay, how are we doing? Okay. So as I said, we're going to do the hemline, and then we're going to do one of the armholes together. I would really love it if you could please post pictures of your finished vest tops. If it's going to take you a few days to finish them, that's absolutely fine. But I really would love to see some of the finished items. There were some lovely skirts made in our last sew along. So it would be really, really lovely to see the fruits of your labor. So please do feel free to post them. Okay, so I'm nearly there. I'm taking my time just to make sure that this hemline is nice and straight. Again, you know, I think when it comes to sewing and making clothing, precision is key in terms of your finished product. So sometimes it does seem like, oh, you know, this is taking ages. But you end up with something that looks really professional. And that, I always say, the finish is what determines whether something looks homemade or not. So, okay, I'm glad you had a play, Wendy, and found the right width of stitch. That's great. Sometimes it does take just getting to know, you know, fiddle around with your machine, do a little bit of testing to check in advance. So that's absolutely the right thing to do. Okay, so I have pinned 3 centimeters all the way around my hemline. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stitch a straight stitch all the way around. Stitch width, I am pushing my needle for the top stitching, Wendy, all the way over to the left. So I guess for me, mine is on 0 because it's all the way to the left. And I guess 7 would be all the way to the right on my machine, because it can move from the left to the middle to the right. Okay, so we're just going to go around, and I want you to be stitching with the fold facing you. You're going to take your stitch length to a normal straight stitch, okay? We don't want to do this in stretch at this point in time. We are literally going to be doing a machine tack stitch all the way around, and I want you to stitch as close as you can to the edge of the fabric. This is purely to hold it in place, okay? We're going to then obviously have our pins out, and then we're going to do the top stitching from the right side of the garment. So first things first, I want you to just stay stitch all the way around the top of that hemline. So I'm going to put my machine on a normal straight stitch. So I'm going to show you which stitch I'm using. So I am using a normal straight stitch, and I'm going to increase my stitch length all the way to 5. Okay, so, and I'm going to place my fabric. There we go. Okay, and press the foot down. So I want to be stitching very close to the edge of this fabric. Okay, so just a nice big tacking stitch. Okay, pull your needle out. Make sure that your fabric is nice and flat. There we go. and try not to stretch. So you'll see this is just a big tacking stitch. Okay, so nice big tacking stitch all the way around the hemline. Okay, it's just to stabilize it at this point. So a nice big tacking stitch all the way around. Okay. I must say, it's gotten a little bit colder the last 2 days, and I was starting to hope that summer was on its way, or spring at least. It's lovely to see the daffodils out. Really nice to see the daffs out for a change. So just doing your stabilizing stitch all the way around. Okay. So just keep going all the way around. Just remember to take your pins out. You don't want to stitch over them. And once we've done gone all the way around the hemline, we're going to change it back to our stretch stitch. How are we doing at home, everybody? Hi, Caroline. Okay, so we're nearly there. Right. Last two. Okay. How are we doing, Anna? Is the stretchy fabric, the lycra fabric, behaving itself? Okay, so we're going to now set our machine back onto our stretch stitch, and you'll see that you have just got a big tacking stitch. So you can see it's just a straight tacking stitch all the way around the hemline of that, measuring the hemstall. That's fine, no problem. So big tacking stitch all the way around the hemline. Now we're going to change the machine onto our stretch stitch again. Okay, I'm going to change my threads back because now we're going to be doing the top stitching. So as I said to you at the beginning, I'm quite a stickler for threads being the right color and things like that. So my fabric is a bit darker, so you can see that you really can see this light gray, whereas on the neckline I've put a slightly darker grey thread on, and to me it blends a bit better than the lighter grey. So I'm just going to change my thread over quickly, and that will give you some time to catch up while I change over. I am going to change my bobbin as well, and actually I can then leave it on because we just have our armbands left to do. Okay, so just quickly change this. Now again, talking about needles, I'm using an 80-12 jersey needle. It's really important, as I said, to make sure that you're using the right needle for the fabric that you are stitching with. So if you are using something that is a higher lycra content, then you will want to use a stretch needle instead. So I like to use Schmetz needles because they are, to me, a superior quality product, and I've used them pretty much all my sewing life. I've tried cheaper needles, but for me, Schmetz are by far the best. So I use the Schmetz. So I've got a ballpoint 80-12 in. If I was working with, say, sweatshirting fabrics, so fabrics that were a bit thicker, then I'd be using a 90/14, so a heavier weight jersey needle. Jersey needles you will use predominantly in fabrics that have a kind of rib effect in the weave. So it's woven in kind of a knitted pattern, okay? So I don't know if you can see that clearly, but you can see that the knit runs down the length of the fabric. So I'm now going to do the top stitching for the neckline. Okay, so let me make sure I've got my press foot here. Okay, so I'm going to take my hemline, and I'm going to start on the side seam, and we're going to stitch all the way around. Now in terms of position, so we've allowed a 3 centimeter hem allowance. I'm going to position my hem fold, so that's this part, the folded edge. I'm going to position that on the 2 centimeter seam allowance marker on the machine needle plate. Okay, so I'm placing it on the 2 needle position, so that on my needle plate, should I say. Okay, so and we are literally going to stitch around the entire hemline, sticking on that number 2 on the fold. Okay, so I've got my needle in my middle position. So needle in the middle. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a quick sip of water. So I'm going to keep my folded edge on the 2, and I'm going to stitch all the way around. And I'm on, excuse me, on a stretch stitch. Okay, so forwards and backwards. Now let your machine do the work. Okay, so I'm going to just show you what I'm seeing on my machine. Okay, so the reason that we are sewing with this part underneath is because we want the feed dogs to do the work. So you'll see I want to keep my folded edge on the 2. Okay, and I'm letting my machine do the work. I'm literally just guiding the fabric to make sure that it's hitting the 2 marker on my needle plate. I'm not stretching my fabric at all. I'm literally just keeping it on the edge of the 2. Okay, so just keep going all the way around. So you'll see there's my stretch stitch, and this row of stitching here, we're going to do our second row of top stitching, and then we're going to pull this row out. Okay, so it's a little bit of a process, as I said, but it just gives you a really nice finish. Okay, so keep going all the way around your hemline. And again, don't stretch or pull or push your fabric, just help ease it in to the machine. Okay. Now when you get to the thick section where you've obviously got your hem folded underneath, so you've got your side seams, so your 2 side seams will be quite thick, just help ease it in underneath the presser foot with your finger. Obviously don't get your finger in the way, but just help to feed that fabric underneath the presser foot. Okay. Now when I was talking about needles in our last class together, when we were making the pattern, I was talking about how you can also use a twin needle. I don't particularly like to use them because I just feel that they are more likely for you to break a thread when you're wearing it, and then your hem starts to unravel. But if you are wanting to have 2 really nice, neat parallel rows of stitching, then it's the needle to use, especially if you are new to sewing and you want to have a really nice, neat finish. I find that those twin needles work well for things like pin tucks. They work really well for pin tucks. So there's a lot of tools we have available to us as you know, sewists. So it's just knowing which ones to use for which applications. So keep going round. Speed up a little bit. Okay, I'm just coming to my joint. I just want to make sure that I get all the other threads out the way so that I don't stitch these all together. Okay. And I want to link up with the previous row stitching and then just back stitch to seal it off. Okay, snip off those threads nice and close to your hemline, to the rows of stitching that you started sewing, where you started sewing. Cut that off nice and close. Okay. So I've done one row all the way around. So now I need to do my second row. Okay. So I'm going to keep my needle in the middle position. Let me have a look. No, I'm going to move my needle to the right. Okay. So I'm going to just show you what I'm doing. Again, this, you know, you can fiddle around with your machine. So at the moment, my needle is in the middle position. So you'll see over here, it's in the middle position. I'm going to move it over to the right. And I'm just going to check, am I actually happy? So basically the width of my stitch will be from here to here. If I used the edge of my presser foot to the middle, that's going to give me about 6 millimeters worth of width. I don't want it so big, so I'm going to do it at the 5, almost the 5. Okay, so again, hold on to those threads as you start to sew. And now this time I'm following this part of my presser foot on this row of stitching. Okay. Again, you're doing it with the right side facing you. And the key here is to keep this presser foot on the edge of this row of stitching. Okay. Trying to do this one-handed is a bit tricky. Okay, so just keep going round, keeping that presser foot on the edge of that row of stitching. So don't rush this, okay? You want to make sure that you are keeping it nice and straight, because when you look at the rows there together, you want them to be parallel to each other all the way along the edge. And then we're going to be taking out this row of stitching. Okay, so we're going to actually take this row of tacking stitching out, but you can see you've got now 2 parallel rows of stretch stitch. So I hope that was helpful in terms of just demonstrating where your presser foot needs to be to give you 2 nice neat rows of stitching. It's much easier with 2 hands than trying to hold the camera at the same time. So just keep going. And again, as we approach that little side seam where you've got a lump of fabric, just help ease it underneath your presser foot. Okay. Okay. So I'm on the last side. How are we doing at home? We're having fun. Okay. The stretch stitch does take a bit longer, as I said, because it's going forwards, backwards, but effectively it's reinforcing the whole way around the seam. So it is worth it. Okay. And I'm nearly back at my starting point. Just snip off that thread. Okay. All right, so nearly there, guys. And then we're going to get stuck into our arm binding next. So we're going to give this a little press, of course. I'm just going to get my iron warming up again. Okay. Right, so that is my hem done. Put my machine there. I'm just going to snip off again those stitches, and now I'm going to pull out the stay stitching. Okay, so that was this big tacking stitch that we put in earlier to hold our hem in place while we did the top stitching. So as I said, you know, some of these processes might seem a little bit long-winded, but it's really just about helping you get a very good finish on what you're making. So as I say, the hand tacking is really important when you're applying a binding, because you only want to stitch top stitch once, and you don't want to miss and have to go back and unpick. So tacking, you know, I tack when it's absolutely necessary and it's going to help with the finish. I don't tack unnecessarily, but it does take a little bit longer. So I guess you could say it's a little bit more slow sewing, but as I say, you just end up with something that is a lot better on the finish and on the quality. So that is what we're after, is making things that people go, where did you buy that? And you can say, I made it. And then they go, wow. So that's quite a nice feeling. So, okay, so I've taken those tacking stitches out. So I'm now going to give this just a little press. Okay, and again, the pressing is all about setting the stitches. Okay, so I am setting those stitches that I have done. Okay. Just moving away from the steam. I've made this top a little bit bigger for my daughter. She's growing at such a rapid rate. It's quite crazy with this lockdown and the children obviously being homeschooling and wearing casual clothes. They haven't worn their uniforms for a while, and my daughter put hers on today and the sleeves were like up here, and my husband's like, oh, you've grown. So yes, we've got to consider this growing. I think for me, I'm growing in other areas that aren't as nice, but anyway. So right, okay, so and Wendy is saying, yes, you get to say you have a me-made item, which is a very nice thing to be able to say to people. So, okay, guys, so I'm going to turn this around so you can see. So we've done our shoulders, we've done the neckband, we've done our hemline. So just have a look and try and find a section. So here you're going to see I've got my overlocking and I've got my 2 rows. This is on the wrong side. And then if I turn it to the right side, you can see we've got a decent hem depth and 2 lovely parallel rows of stitches. That is still stretchy, okay? And if that does get pulled a little bit too tight and you hear a popping sound, on other t-shirts where they kind of use a twin needle or a cover stitch, if that stitch pops, you end up losing some of your hem, so it will then unravel. This sort of finish will mean that you don't. Okay, so we've got our hem done. So we are now going to move on to the armhole. Okay, are we all ready to do the armhole? Or is it okay if I move on to doing the armhole? Okay, so right, with your pattern pieces, we cut our armhole binding. We did our armhole binding and we cut it the same, again, the same principle that we applied for the neckline, okay? So we cut it the same size as the finished circumference of our armhole on our pattern piece. So if we take off our seam allowance, so we're going to sew 1.5 centimeters, it then reduces the entire circumference by 3 centimeters. Does that make sense? So your arm binding was originally cut to the finished circumference measurement of your armhole. Okay, so that's once you've sewn your seam allowance away on your shoulder and your side seam. So we made our binding to that finished measurement. If we now sew 1.5, okay, if we sew 1.5 centimeters seam allowance, we're going to reduce that measurement by 3 centimeters. That's okay, Candace? Sleep well. So I'm going to take my armband. Now, like my neckband, I knew that I wanted to make my neckband a little bit smaller. So I'm going to apply exactly the same principle to that of my arm bindings. So I'm going to take off a further centimeter off my arm bindings so that it hugs the body instead of standing away from the body. So if those two edges are going to be joined together, I'm going to take off 5 millimeters on each side, or you could cut off a centimeter. It doesn't really matter. The principle is you're going to take off whatever it is you feel you need to draw your armhole in a little bit. So I'm going to take off a centimeter off the one side, but I'm doing it on both armbands, okay? So I've got 2 here, okay? So I'm going to take off my centimeter, and I'm now going to take one of these armbands. You could do both, the arm bindings, and you're going to put them right sides together, like so. And we're going to join them together on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, so 1.5, and I'm going to join them together like that. So we're going to sew 1.5 across the bottom like that. Okay. And I'm going to make sure that my needle is back in the middle position, because if I leave my needle to the far right, it's then going to be taking off less than my seam allowance. So make sure that you're back in the normal stitching position and that you're on your stretch stitch and that you're doing a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Okay. And you're going to do exactly the same to your other arm binding. So what I'd suggest is that what you do to the one, you do to the other one straight away. So that, I know we're only going to put one on together this evening, but just prepare your other one so that you know that that one's ready to apply in the same way. So we're just going to join that underarm seam effectively together on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Okay. And exactly the same as when we applied our neckband, you're going to press that seam allowance open. Okay, so we're going to press it open like that. And that again is just to stretch and set your stitches in place. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly give that a little press. And I'm going to do the same with the other one. Okay. Now, with our neckband, we quartered the circumference of the neckband itself, and then we quartered the circumference of the neckline. So we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to take our neckband and we're going to divide it into 4. So we have 4 equal sections, okay? So we know that the join is going to be the starting point. So we want to come down to the fold, you're going to put in a little snip. So that is half, okay? And then I want you to take that snip and match it with that seam. So you'll see there I've got my notch, and I'm going to match it up with that seam, like so. And then if I fold down to the bottom here, I'm going to put a little snip in over here, which becomes one of the quarters. And then if I check, I want those guys still to match up again, and I'm going to fold down to the bottom and put another snip in the bottom. So that means that I have got my neckband quartered. Okay, so I've got my circle and I have 4 little snips. I've got 1, 2, there's 2. I've got my central seam or my underarm seam, 3 and 4. Okay, so pop that to one side. Obviously you're going to duplicate, so I'm going to duplicate it now just so that I can give you a chance to catch up. So again, I'm taking my central seam and I'm folding it in half and I'm putting in a snip. And then I'm taking that that little notch that I've just made, I'm matching it up with that center seam or the join, and I fold down to the bottom and I pop another little snip and I check that those two match up, and I've come down to the bottom and I do another little snip. Okay, just a very small snip. Okay, you don't want to cut too deeply because then you're going to interfere with your binding. Okay, so now I've got to take my armhole. Okay, so this is the neckband. We've done our neckline. Now we're doing the armhole. Okay, so our armhole to me looks pretty even. We're going to start with the center, well, we're calling this our center back. It's actually the underarm seam. So we've got underarm seam and we have our underarm seam. And we want to make sure, so lay it flat on the table, okay, and then just put the edges together gently. Don't stretch anything. Just put them together and walk it to see. And I would say that that's pretty accurate in terms of being my halfway point. So if I then take my shoulder, it might be that it's like that for you, that you have a longer back or a longer front, but just work them together to find your midpoint, okay? Then you put a snip in the middle. So I know that my shoulder seam is my middle. So I'm then going to put those two together and I work back this way. And I put in another snip here. There we go. So I've got a little snip there. And then I work from my middle to the left again. Okay, so from the middle, and I'm working back. I'm not stretching anything. I'm just gently rolling the fabric between my fingers. And I'm putting in another little snip over there. So I have 4 reference points. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm going to start at my underarm. Make sure that your side seam goes the same way at your underarm. Okay, I'm going to place a pin to hold that in place. Okay, and I'm going to take my binding. Where's it gone? Okay, I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to place it right side facing the wrong side. Okay, so right side of my binding facing the wrong side of my top. And position the join at the underarm seam. Okay, so I'm now going to position that pin in place. Like so. And I'm now going to just match those quarters again. Okay, so you'll see my arm is bigger than my binding. Okay, and that's because I want my binding to stretch onto my armband. So I'm finding my second notch and my second notch, and I'm putting them together again. Can you see that? So placing those two together. Okay. And then I'm going to take my third notch and join it to the shoulder seam, like so. Okay, third notch onto my shoulder seam. And then the last one, the last notch onto my last notch. Okay, like so. Okay, pop another pin in. So what we're going to do now is basically pin the two together all the way around the armhole again. Okay, so we'll demonstrate from behind. I hope this is making sense. Okay, so I've got a pin here, and I've got a pin here. So you can see that my binding is tighter than the actual armhole. Okay, so I'm going to stretch nice and evenly and place. I want to keep those edges together. Oh, there we go. Put another pin in and then lift this up, place another pin in at the top. So you want those edges together nicely like that. And pop a pin in at the top like that. So keep pinning your binding on all the way around. My iron saying, okay, I'm going off to sleep now. So keep pinning your binding to your armhole all the way around. And then we're going to stitch them together with a stretch stitch on a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Okay. So I'm popping in quite a few pins just to keep it all together. It makes the stitching a lot easier the more pins you have in place to secure that neckband and to keep it in position on the edge. So I hope this is helpful. So we're going to whiz around on a 1 centimeter seam allowance using your stretch stitch on your machine, because obviously you want your armhole to be flexible so that it's more comfortable when you're wearing it. I've just got 1 more quarter to pin. How are we doing, Karen? Oh, I'm glad you like the fabric, Janine. This is some leftover. I made myself a drop shoulder t-shirt last summer, and this is a little bit leftover. My daughter loves wearing matchy things, and to be fair, I don't mind it. I quite like it. So there was a little bit left over, so I managed to squeeze this vest out for her. Okay, right, so, and that's what's nice about having little ladies that we can sew for. Great, that's good. Okay, so we've got the band pinned on, so you can see there's the back of the band, and again, it's right side facing the wrong side of the fabric. So we're going to stitch around 1 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of pressing, so make sure that your needle is in the middle position, and I'm going to start underneath my armpit. So I'm going to start at the side seam and work my way around. Make sure that you keep your seam allowance open under your armpit. Okay, so 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm just checking that that seam allowance stays nice and flat. So whiz round on a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And again, just keep checking, lifting your fabric up underneath, just checking it's nice and straight as you go. Okay. Just keep checking that it's nice and straight. So we're going to press our seams open once we've come all the way around the circle. And as I said, we're going to do just one together and then we'll wrap it up for the evening. So we are going a little bit over time now, but then at least you will know that you're just duplicating this process again to do your second armhole. Now this process you could also, this technique should I say, you could also apply if you were using if you were applying a binding to a woven garment, you know, applying it right side facing the wrong side of your fabric. So the principle is exactly the same. Okay. Exactly the same. So just keep going on your 1 centimeter seam allowance all the way around. Okay. Just double checking that I'm not folding anything over. Okay, snip that off. Okie dokie. Okay, and again, we're just going to reduce the seam allowance on that join. Okay, and that's just to eliminate some of the bulk. So we don't want to have a big lump underneath our armpit. That can be a bit uncomfortable. So also fold back your seam allowance so that you can get to the overlocking your side seam, so you trim that down. So I've reduced the bulk on that side seam quite significantly. Okay, so that's the right side of my garment, wrong side, and the right side of my binding facing the wrong side of my top. So again, I'm just going to give that a little quick press, and then we're going to get folding. I'm going to use my little sleeve roll just to help out with the pressing. So always press those seams open. So you want to press it open first, and then we're going to push the seam allowance toward the binding itself. Okay, so press it open. And I've also got a shoulder seam here I need to trim. So I'm just going to take that little excess, that little bit of excess away at the top of the shoulder as well. Again, it's just, if you cut away these bulky bits, it makes it a lot easier when you're trying to finish the stitching, because it'll move through the machine more easily because there's no bulk in the way. Okay. So just go around your armhole nicely, pressing that seam allowance open first, and then press them in towards the binding. Again, we're not stretching anything. This is purely just to relax any tension in the stitches, and that's why I like to press as I go. And again, you know, the pressing helps you have a really nice, neat finish when you're done. So we're going to get on to folding the binding over, and we're going to tack it again using a hand needle and thread. So we're going to tack it in place first, and then finally top stitch with the machine. And Anna, remember to use a press cloth with the more lycra rich fabrics, okay? So with the more kind of synthetic fabrics. Okay, so that's what your, just put that there. That is what your arm binding will look like. So you can see it is definitely smaller than that of the armhole itself. So again, now we're going to do our folding. So I'm going to show it to you this way. I'm going to trim off these corners as well, okay, like we did before. Okay, so I'm just going to trim off the corner like so, and then I'm going to trim off the corner like so. So this just reduces the bulk in the armhole. So my seam allowance is going to face up. I'm going to fold the seam part of my binding over, and then I'm going to fold it over the edge again like that. Okay, so let's go back. So fold in half. So there's your binding, there's your seam allowance. So fold it so that the binding is kind of meeting your seam allowance, and then fold it over again like so. And you're going to place a pin in like so and out like so. Okay, so you're going to be catching the fold, and just keep doing that all the way around. So fold in half and then fold again. Okay, so I'm going to change the angle of the camera just to show you that technique once more. Okay, so you're going to fold in half and then fold over again. Oops. Let's try again. Okay, so fold in half and then fold over and place a pin in and place a pin out. Okay, so your objective is to cover this row of stitches with your binding. So fold and fold again and place a pin in. And you're just going to do this all the way around the armhole. And again, you want to make sure that you keep it the same width all the way around. So keep it nice and even. And then we're going to get a hand needle and thread and just run a tacking stitch all the way around. Now you could do it with a machine. I like to do it by hand because I can control the fabric a lot better. So again, it just helps me to, I can easily, if I think, oh no, I'm going to miss that with the machine, and if I'm hand tacking, I can easily just roll a little bit less or roll a little bit more under the fold. Okay, so as I say, this is just to help give you a really nice, neat finish. We're almost there, guys, almost there. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's session and that you've learned a couple things that you didn't know before. Who's learned at least something new tonight? At least one thing. Okay, so we're nearly there. Okay. Right. Okay, so I have pinned the whole of my armhole. So I'm just going to do that running stitch using purple thread again. I just use up all my bobbin threads that I'm not going to be needing or using. I tend to, one of my little top tips. Oh, that's great, Angie. I'm so glad. And Meryl, thank you. I'm glad that you've learned something new. One of my top tips is using up you know, like if you're sewing something and you've got some leftover bobbin thread, if it's a color that you're not really going to use again, then I use it when I'm doing gathering or stay stitching. So that way I clear my bobbins of unwanted threads, because I always use them when, so I will use up those bobbin threads for things like, as I say, gathering or stay stitching or tacking like this, when I'm going to be pulling it out, if I know I'm not going to need that thread again for some time. And then it stops me wasting my actual thread. So just literally use a running stitch, as I said, along the edge, like so, as close to that folded edge as possible. Okay. So all the way around, and then we're just going to machine. And as I said, you're going to repeat this process on the other arm, and then hopefully you're going to send me a picture of your finished summer vest top, because I'd love to see it. I would love to see it. Okay, so just going to whiz around doing the tacking. Okay, and you'll kind of see, oh dear, have I made a knot? No, it's all good. There we go. You'll kind of see that the stitches are running in the fold, not in the fold, where my binding meets my actual top. And that means that when we come to stitch, it'll be nicely hidden in that kind of seam line. Right, nearly there. Okay, so nearly there, and then I'll just set you up again with the position. It will be, I've got a pin coming out here, I've just got to stabilize that quickly. It'll be very much in the same position as what we used for the neckline. So the presser foot on the edge of the fold, so the edge of the outer edge of your binding. So you just want to make sure when you are doing the tacking stitches that you are covering the previous row of stitching. Okay, we don't want that to be visible. So that's the objective of doing the binding. In this way we are covering the previous row of stitches. And also this technique gives you more of a casual look. Okay, I'm sure it will be, Meryl. I'm sure it will be. It's practice makes perfect. So as I said, maybe you need to make some knickers and you'll be a pro at attaching bindings in no time. Yes, so this type of binding where we kind of rolling it over to the top, it gives us a decorative feature on the top. So it's one method of applying a binding. There are many methods. This is one method. And this gives a more casual effect to vests or to garments. So if you are wanting, you know, to kind of make something a little bit more casual, you can always put the binding on the outer edge. Some garments call for the binding to be on the inside, but traditionally t-shirts and stretch vest tops, you have your stitching on the outer edge. Right, nearly there, guys. How are we doing? How are we doing? Okay. Right, so last row of stitching for now. I'm going to finish the other one off, and I will post a picture of the finished product too, so you can see. Okay, so that is the stay stitching in place on the armhole. So again, you can see that armhole binding is actually drawing in. Okay, so that's going to sit nicely against the skin, and it's not kind of standing away from the body. So I'm going to position, and I'm going to start from the underarm seam and work my way around the armhole. Okay, again, I'm still on a stretch stitch. I'm placing my presser foot on the edge, so I'm going to just show you. Okay, and I am moving my needle over from the middle position to the far left, and I am going to be positioning my presser foot on the edge of the fabric, like so. Okay, and I want to make sure that I'm going to be stitching close to that folded edge. There we go. So I want to make sure that I'm not going to go over the edge of the fold. Okay, let me just get that little thread out the way and just keep going around the armhole. Needle in. This is quite tricky doing this one-handed, I have to say, but just go nice and slowly all the way around your armhole. Okay, so I know that mine is a little bit popping out the side here. I'm going to just keep it the same all the way around. So effectively, it's touching my 1 centimeter guide. Okay, but that's kind of happened because I'm trying to do it one-handed, hold the camera so that you can see that we don't want to stitch over the edge of this fold. Okay, you want to be catching the fabric, you see, so at least it's nice and even all the way along. Okay, so just keep going around your armhole binding. Okay, and you'll see that I'm trying to make sure that everything is nice and flat as it approaches the machine. So keep going with that as you go around. So keep stitching. I'm nearly at the end. And then back stitch. Okay, there we go. So you'll pull out all of the other stitches and snip off your threads nice and neatly. Make sure that there's no little tufts anywhere. Okay, and then again, give it a good press. Make sure you do exactly the same to the other armhole. And I've just got to take that thread out, but really that's kind of what it will look like on the wrong side. And then when you turn it round to the right side, it's like magic. There we go. So we've done one armhole, so I've just got to finish off this armhole on this side, but hopefully that gives you an idea on how to do bindings on stretch fabrics. So as I say, the armhole is still stretchy, it's got the right shape, and it's not bagging away from the body. So guys, I think I will leave you all there this evening, and I hope that you enjoyed today's session. It's been lovely spending the evening with you, and I look forward to when we will come together again sometime and do another sew along. Send me some suggestions of things that you would like to do, as I said, and I'll have a look and see what I can put together. There's a couple of things that I said I am toying with in terms of ideas, but do feel free to give me your suggestions. Please post pictures of your finished vest tops. I'd love to see them, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you all hopefully sometime soon. Have a lovely evening. Bye for now, everybody.